On a Wednesday morning in March, I was sitting at my desk at work eating a granola bar and reviewing a spreadsheet when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost didn't answer. That decision, the one I made in the 2 seconds between seeing an unknown number and pressing accept, is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story today. Is this Sloan Mercer? The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the particular kind of calm that isn't relaxed, it's trained. The kind of voice that has learned to deliver information without inflection, so the person on the other end can't tell where the call is going until it gets there. "Yes," I said, "this is Sloan." "Ms. Mercer, my name is Special Agent Daniel Holt. I'm calling from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." I put down my granola bar. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about a loan application filed approximately 4 months ago with a lending institution in your state. The application lists you as a cosigner. I want to verify your involvement before we proceed any further." My involvement. Before we proceed. "Agent Holt," I said, and I heard my own voice do something very strange. Go very steady, very quiet, in the way it does when I understand something significant and don't yet have words for all of it. "Can you tell me whose names are on the loan application as the primary borrowers?" He told me, my parents' names. I already knew before he said them. I don't know exactly how I knew. Maybe because of the specific way he'd said, "verify your involvement." Maybe because of something older and deeper, a pattern I had been living inside for 31 years that in the 2 minutes since I'd answered my phone had snapped into a focus so sharp it almost took my breath away. My parents had used my identity as a cosigner. They had doctored my signature. They had inflated my income on the application. They had used my social security number. And the FBI had called me before they called anyone else. I want you to understand what that moment was like. Not the anger, not the grief, not the specific nauseating recognition that the people who raised you were capable of this. I want you to understand the silence, the way the office around me, the hum of the HVAC, the keyboard clicking in the cubicle next to mine, the distant sound of someone's phone ringing down the hall, all of it felt very far away, like I was inside a glass room and the rest of the world was happening on the other side of it. I sat in that silence for about 4 seconds, and then I made a decision. In about 100 minutes, you are going to understand every piece of this story. Where it came from, what it cost, what I chose to do, and what happened to every single person involved when those choices played out. But first, you need to understand who I am, and you need to understand what kind of family uses their daughter's identity as a financial tool, because that's not something that happens out of nowhere. It happens at the end of a very long road. My name is Sloan. I'm 31 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I work as a financial operations manager for a mid-sized healthcare company. I have worked in finance in some capacity since I was 22, first as a bookkeeper, then as an accounts manager, then in my current role, which I have held for 3 years and which I am, by every measure. I tell you the profession first because it matters to everything that comes after. I know how numbers work. I know how loans work. I know what an inflated income figure on a loan application means legally. I know what a doctored signature constitutes. I know what the FBI's Financial Crimes Division investigates and why. And because I know all of those things, the morning of that phone call was different for me than it might have been for someone who didn't have this particular background. I understood almost immediately exactly what had happened and exactly how serious it was. My parents, Roy and Linda Mercer, live in Greensboro, about an hour and a half from me. My father is 63. He spent most of his career in residential real estate, which went well for about 20 years and then didn't, and which left him by his late 50s with inconsistent income, a complicated credit history, and the particular combination of financial desperation and pride that makes some people make very bad decisions. My mother is 61. She has worked various jobs over the years: retail management, school administration, a brief period running a small catering business that folded. She is warm in the way that makes people like her immediately. And she is also someone who has, for as long as I can remember, prioritized the appearance of stability over its substance. They look like a normal couple from the outside. Neat house, nice car, Christmas cards with a photo every year. The kind of couple you'd see at a neighborhood gathering and think, they've figured it out. They haven't figured it out. They have been, for most of my adult life, quietly drowning. And I have been, for most of my adult life, one of the things they use to stay afloat. Not the only thing, but a significant one. I want to take you back to when this pattern started, because it didn't begin with the loan. It began when I was 23 years old, just graduated, first real job, first paycheck that felt like it might actually be enough. My father called me 3 weeks into that job. He needed help. Not much, just a bridge loan, he said, to cover a gap between real estate commissions. The market had been slow. He had a deal closing soon. He just needed $800 to cover 2 months of mortgage payments until the commission came through. I had $800. I'd been saving since high school. I sent it. The deal closed. The money came back. That was how it started, with a transaction that worked, that was returned, that felt like proof that this was just what family did in tight moments. And then the next call came, and the one after that. Over the following 8 years, I loaned my parents money on 17 separate occasions. I kept records. This is important. I kept records because I am a person who keeps records. Not because I suspected anything in the early years. I just tracked it the way I tracked everything. A spreadsheet, simple and clear. Date, amount, stated purpose, repayment date if one was given. The total across those 8 years was $43,200. The amount repaid, $11,000. The remaining $32,000 was not refused, not disputed, not explained. It simply stopped being mentioned. Each new request arrived as though the previous ones had been resolved, as though money once given to my parents entered a kind of family accounting system that operated by different rules than the ones I used at work. At work, a dollar loaned was a dollar owed. In my family, a dollar given was simply a dollar given. I made my peace with this understanding gradually over years. I stopped expecting repayment around loan number 9 or 10. I started thinking of the money not as a loan I was extending, but as a cost I was absorbing, the price of being the child in this family who had a stable income and was therefore, by unspoken agreement, responsible for stabilizing others. I also had a brother. His name is Derek. He's 35, 4 years older than me. Derek's relationship with money is complicated in a different way from our parents'. He has always been entrepreneurial in spirit and catastrophic in execution. Businesses launched with enthusiasm and abandoned with loss, partnerships that fell apart, investments that didn't pan out. My parents have bailed him out more times than I can count, often using money I had recently given them for something else. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the financially stable person in an unstable family. It's not just the money. It's the constant ambient awareness that your stability is not entirely your own, that it exists in a family ecosystem that has learned to draw from it, that you have built something careful and solid, and there are hands reaching towards it that you can't quite bring yourself to remove because they belong to people you love. I had that exhaustion for 8 years before the Wednesday morning phone call. The phone call is not where the story ends, but it is where the story turns. I want to tell you about a few specific moments from those 8 years, because they form the context for everything that came later, and because I think if you've been in a similar situation, You'll recognize something in them. The first is from when I was 26. My parents needed a new car. Their old one, a 15-year-old sedan with a transmission that had been failing for 2 years, finally died completely. My father called me on a Thursday night to explain the situation. He had found a used car he liked. The dealer required a credit check. My father's credit, at that point, had been damaged by several years of late payments and a partial default on a business loan from 5 years prior. He asked if I would co-sign. I said yes. I did research first. I always did research. I read the terms. I understood what co-signing meant legally. I signed knowing the risk, believing that my parents would make the payments because they needed the car to function and because my father had a deal closing that month and things were going to get better. They made 14 months of payments. Then they missed 2. I covered them, not because they asked me to, but because the car payment was linked to my credit and I would not allow missed payments to appear on my report. I covered them and called my father and told him this could not happen again. He said it wouldn't. It happened again 6 months later. I covered those 2. When the car was finally paid off, 3 years after I co-signed, my credit report showed 12 months of on-time payments and 2 months of late ones. Covered before they became delinquent, but still visible to anyone who knew how to read a credit report carefully. I spent 2 years after that car was paid off carefully rebuilding the clean history those 2 months had interrupted. The second moment is from when I was 28. My parents were having trouble with their mortgage. A refinancing situation had gone wrong. They had taken out a home equity line of credit 3 years prior to cover Derek's latest business venture and had been managing the payments irregularly ever since. The bank was threatening to accelerate the balance. My mother called me on a Sunday morning. She was crying, the specific, slightly theatrical crying my mother produces when the situation is genuinely serious, but she also knows that tears have historically been effective with me. I have spent a lot of therapy time understanding the difference between that cry and her genuine distress. I am still not always sure I can tell the difference. She explained the situation. She needed $18,000 to bring the equity line current. Without it, the bank might begin proceedings that would put the house at risk. I did not have $18,000 liquid at that time. I had savings, but much of it was tied up in a retirement account I didn't want to touch. I told her I could do $8,000. She said, would that be enough to make a meaningful difference? I said I didn't know, but it was what I had available. I sent $8,000. The house was not lost. The equity line situation was eventually restructured. I do not know what happened to the other $10,000 they apparently needed, and I learned over years not to ask questions whose answers I didn't want to have. The third moment is the one that matters most to everything that came later. It happened 4 months before the FBI phone call. My parents called me on a weekend, a Saturday afternoon, which they usually saved for calls about things that weren't urgent, but that they'd been building up to through the week. My mother did most of the talking, with my father occasionally adding a confirming detail in the background. They were describing a financial situation that had become critical. My father's real estate work had essentially dried up, the market in their area had shifted, and his client base, never robust, had thinned to almost nothing. My mother's most recent job had ended when the company she worked for restructured. They had debt. The equity line, a personal loan, credit card balances they'd accumulated over years of the gap between income and outgo, and the minimum payments on all of it were becoming impossible to manage together. We've been looking at consolidation, my mother said. There's a loan product that would roll everything into one payment, lower rate, longer term. It would make the monthly number manageable. Okay, I said. What does that involve? A pause. The thing is, our credit, with everything that's happened, we don't qualify on our own. We'd need a co-signer with strong credit and verifiable income. And there it was, the request I had been recognizing for 8 years, arriving once more in a slightly different form. I sat with it for a moment. And then I said something I had never said before in 8 years of these calls. Mom, I'm not going to co-sign anything else. I've done it before, and it's cost me. I'll help you think through other options, but I can't put my name on another loan. The silence on the line was different from the usual pauses. We understand, my mother said finally. We were just asking. We'll figure something else out. She said it with a warmth that felt genuine. I believed her. I should not have believed her.
The FBI call was on a Wednesday morning in March. But the full understanding of what had happened, the complete, documented, devastating picture, came in the 2 weeks that followed. After I hung up with Special Agent Holt, and I'll tell you in a moment exactly what I said to him on that call, I sat at my desk for about 7 minutes without doing anything. My granola bar was still on my desk, my spreadsheet was still open, my office was still humming with the normal sounds of a Wednesday morning. And I thought, I need information before I do anything else. I pulled up my credit report. I use a monitoring service that sends alerts, and I had received one, just one, flagged for a new account inquiry about 4 months prior. At the time, I had looked at it, not recognized the lending institution's name, and flagged it to follow up on. I had not followed up. It had been a busy period at work, and a single inquiry wasn't alarming enough to prioritize. I was looking at that inquiry now with completely different eyes. I requested my full credit report immediately. The loan appeared on it, a personal consolidation loan for $187,000, showing me as co-signer, my parents as primary borrowers. The application had been processed 4 months earlier, approved based on the combined credit profile, and the funds had been dispersed about 2 weeks after approval. $187,000. I sat with that number. This was not the casual, incremental borrowing of the previous 8 years. This was a formal, documented, legally binding financial instrument bearing my name, my social security number, and, I would confirm with Agent Holt over the following days, a signature that had been created by scanning an old document of mine that bore my actual signature and digitally transferring it to the loan application. My parents had scanned my signature from some previous document, something I had signed for them years ago in good faith, and they had lifted it and placed it on a loan application they filed without my knowledge, consent, or presence. I want to pause here and name what that is, because sometimes when things happen within families, there's a gravitational pull towards softening the language, toward calling it a mistake or a desperate decision, or something people do when they're not thinking clearly. I am a financial operations manager. I work in compliance-adjacent roles. I know what the technical terms are. What my parents did is called loan application fraud. What they did with my identity is called identity theft. What they did with my signature is called forgery. These are federal crimes, and the FBI was investigating them. I took a personal day that Wednesday afternoon. I called my boss and said I had a family situation I needed to address. She said, "Of course, take the time." I drove home, changed out of my work clothes, made a very strong cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and my phone, and started working. I called my lawyer, a woman named Patricia, who specializes in financial and contract law. I had retained her 2 years prior for an unrelated contract review and kept her number because I believed in having people available before you needed them urgently. I told Patricia everything. I had it all. 17 transactions, 8 years, documented in a spreadsheet I maintained out of financial habit. The Saturday afternoon call noted in my phone log, the monitoring alert from 4 months prior still in my email, my credit report freshly pulled. "Sloan," Patricia said, "you are in a significantly better position than most people who call me with this kind of situation. Most people have nothing documented. You have everything. What do I do?" She told me in precise, practical, step-by-step terms that I appreciated more than I can express. Patricia told me exactly what to do. Step 1, cooperate fully with Agent Holt's investigation. This meant being honest, being available, providing every document requested, and doing so without alerting my parents that I had been contacted. Agent Holt had asked me, at the end of our initial call, not to communicate with my parents about the investigation until he gave me clearance to do so. This was, Patricia confirmed, standard procedure and entirely appropriate. Step 2, file a formal identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission through their identitytheft.gov portal, which creates an official record and initiates the process of formally disputing the fraudulent account on my credit report. Step 3, contact the lending institution directly, the bank that had issued the loan, and notify them formally of the fraudulent co-signing, following up Agent Holt's investigative contact with my own independent documentation. Step 4. Place a fraud alert and then a credit freeze on all 3 of my credit bureaus to prevent any further accounts from being opened using my identity. Step 5. Begin compiling every piece of documentation, every prior loan, every financial transaction, every communication with my parents about money into an organized file that Agent Holt, or potentially a prosecutor, might find useful. I completed all 5 steps within 48 hours of the initial phone call. Not because I was trying to punish my parents, because Patricia had made something very clear to me, sitting at my kitchen table with my strong coffee on that Wednesday afternoon. Sloan, I want you to understand something. You did not create this situation. You said no, clearly and directly. They proceeded anyway using your name without your consent. Cooperating fully with this investigation is not betrayal. It is the only appropriate response to what has been done to you. I have turned that sentence over many times since. Cooperating fully is not betrayal. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being the reliable person in an unreliable family. The thing that nobody warns you about when you spend years absorbing and smoothing and quietly managing the consequences of other people's choices. When the consequences finally arrive that you cannot absorb, when they come in the form of an FBI investigation using your name and your number and your forged signature, the pull to protect the people who caused them is still there. Even then, even at that point, I felt it. I want to be honest about that. Standing in my kitchen on that Wednesday evening, knowing that my parents were in Greensboro, an hour and a half away, not yet knowing that I had spoken to anyone, and knowing that what I was building in that folder on my laptop would form part of a federal investigation, I felt the pull to call them. Not to warn them, or not only to warn them, just to hear their voice, to hear my mother say something that might somehow make this not be what it was. I did not call them. I called Patricia instead. And Patricia said, the pull you're feeling is not love. It's a pattern. A very long, very deeply established pattern of protecting people who have not protected you. Feel it, and then do the right thing anyway. I did. I need to tell you about a conversation that almost occurred. About 2 weeks into the investigation, 2 weeks of cooperating with Agent Holt, providing documentation, watching the official process unfold with the slow, methodical thoroughness of a federal inquiry, my mother called me. A normal call. A Sunday afternoon call, her usual warm, slightly performative cheerfulness intact. She asked about my week. She mentioned the weather in Greensboro. She asked if I had seen a new show she'd been watching. She did not mention the loan. She did not mention the FBI. As far as I could tell, she did not yet know that I knew. I answered her questions. I asked a few of my own. I said the right things in the right places. I behaved on that call like a daughter who was having a normal Sunday conversation with her mother, because that is what I was supposed to do until Agent Holt told me otherwise. And then, near the end of the call, my mother said something that I have thought about many times since. Sloan, I've been meaning to tell you. Your father and I got some things sorted out, financially. The situation has stabilized. I know we've leaned on you a lot over the years, and I just want you to know things are better now. The situation has stabilized. I understood in that moment that she was telling me about the loan. Not directly, not with any acknowledgement of what they had done to get there, but she was telling me that the money existed, that things were better, that the problem that had prompted the Saturday afternoon call 4 months ago had been solved. She thought I didn't know how. She thought the situation had been managed cleanly, that I was still the daughter who didn't know, who had said no to a co-signing request months ago, and then had been stepped around, her name quietly borrowed, her credit quietly used, the whole transaction completed without her awareness. She thought she was telling me that things were fine. "I'm glad to hear it, Mom," I said, and I meant it in a way she couldn't possibly understand on that Sunday afternoon. I hung up. I called Patricia. I said, "My mother just told me things have stabilized. She thinks I don't know." Patricia said, "That's consistent with what Agent Holt indicated. They haven't been formally contacted yet. It's coming." "How soon?" "Soon," she said. I sat with that for a moment. "Patricia, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When this becomes public, and it will become public, right? Through the investigation, through the legal process? It's likely, yes. There are people in Greensboro who know my parents, family friends, people from their church, people who have known me my whole life. And when they find out what happened, they are going to find out that I cooperated." A pause. "Yes," Patricia said. "They will." I exhaled. "Okay," I said. I needed to name that out loud. I needed to hear myself say it and decided anyway. And I decided anyway. Let me ask you something right now. Has anyone ever put you in a position where you had to choose between what was right and what your family wanted you to do? And those were genuinely different things? Where the family call, the blood pull, the 31 years of being the person who kept the peace, all of it was on one side, and the truth was on the other? Drop it in the comments. I think more people know that exact feeling than are willing to say so in conversation. Right here, this is the moment. My mother on the phone telling me things have stabilized, not knowing that I know everything. An FBI agent with a file containing my documentation, Patricia with a strategy, me sitting in my Charlotte apartment having decided, clearly, completely, without drama, what I was going to do. But the question that nobody has answered yet is the one you've been sitting with since the first minute of this story. What did I say to Agent Holt on that first call on that Wednesday morning when he told me I was potentially a victim and asked me to take my time? What did I say? Because that decision, what I said in those minutes, is what set everything else in motion. Before I tell you, if this story is reaching something real in you, if you've ever been the person whose name was used without permission, financially, legally, emotionally, and you've been sitting here thinking, somebody finally said this out loud, hit subscribe right now. I make a new story every single week about families, about money, about the specific cost of being the person everyone assumes will absorb the consequences of their choices. Subscribe. And then stay. Because what I said to Agent Holt and what happened to my parents when the investigation reached them is the part of the story I have never told anyone outside of a lawyer's office. I told him the truth, all of it. I want to be clear about what that meant, because I think people sometimes imagine that moment, the moment of telling a federal agent the truth about your own parents, as dramatic, as emotional, as some kind of breaking point. It wasn't. It was, in fact, the most composed I had felt in years. Agent Holt asked me on that first call to walk me through any previous financial interactions I had with my parents. He explained that the investigation had flagged several things about the application that had prompted this verification call: inconsistencies in the income documentation, questions about the signature methodology, and that my account of the relationship's history would help him understand the fuller context. I told him I had records, 8 years of records, 17 transactions, a spreadsheet. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Mercer, do you have access to those records right now? I can have them to you within the hour. That would be very helpful." I sent the spreadsheet. I sent the phone log from the Saturday afternoon call. I sent the monitoring alert from 4 months prior. I sent my credit report. Within 48 hours, I had given Agent Holt everything Patricia had advised me to compile. Over the following 3 weeks, there were 4 more calls with Agent Holt or members of his team. Each one was professional, thorough, and conducted with a clarity that I found, and I recognize this might sound strange, genuinely stabilizing. There was no ambiguity in those calls. Every question had a right answer. Every document either confirmed something or didn't. After 8 years of a financial relationship with my parents that operated in a fog of soft language and unspoken agreements and money that changed hands without clear terms, dealing with a federal investigation felt almost like breathing fresh air. The numbers were what they were. The documents said what they said. On the 22nd day after the initial call, Agent Holt contacted my parents. He contacted them separately. My father first, then my mother, approximately 4 hours apart on the same day. I know the timeline because Patricia had contacts who could advise on the general procedural sequence, and because Agent Holt, in a brief call to me that afternoon, confirmed that initial contact had been made and that I would likely be hearing from my parents. He was right. My mother called me at 7:14 that evening. I had been expecting the call since approximately 3 in the afternoon. I had spent those 4 hours doing normal things, making dinner, going for a walk, reading a chapter of a book I'd been trying to finish for a month, in the deliberate way that I have learned to structure time when I am waiting for something significant. Not white-knuckling it, just being present in my life while the thing I was waiting for moved closer. When her name appeared on my phone at 7:14, I looked at it for one full ring. Then I answered. Sloan. Her voice was different from any version of it I had heard in 31 years. Not the warm performance, not the managed distress, not the Sunday afternoon cheerfulness. This was something stripped of all of that. Just sound. Just the word of my name carrying the weight of everything she now knew I knew. Mom, an agent called. I know. He said that you were the one who... She stopped, started again. He said you provided documentation. Yes, a long silence. Sloan, we were going to tell you. I sat with that for a moment. When? No answer. Mom, when were you going to tell me? Still nothing. I said no, I said, clearly, directly, on a Saturday afternoon 4 months ago. You called me back that same week and said you'd figure something else out. And then you used my signature on a loan application and submitted it to a federal lending institution. Her breathing had changed. She was crying. The real kind this time, I thought, though I have acknowledged I cannot always be certain. We were desperate, she said. We didn't know what else to do. You could have told me the truth about how desperate you were. You would have said no. Yes, I said. I would have. The silence after that was very long. And then I said the thing I had been thinking about for 22 days, since the morning Agent Holt first called. Mom, I want you to understand something. I'm not angry. I want to say that clearly because I know what you're expecting and I don't want you to be surprised. I'm not going to yell. I'm not going to threaten. I'm not going to tell you I hate you. A small sound on her end. Something between a breath and a word. What you did has consequences that are already in motion. I cooperated with the investigation because what you did to me is a federal crime, and I had no legal or ethical basis for doing anything other than telling the truth. That is the choice I made. I made it once. 3 weeks ago, and I'm not going to revisit it. Sloan, I'm not finished. She went quiet. I have one thing I need to say, and then I'm going to let you go, because you and Dad need to talk to lawyers, and I need to let this process do what it's going to do without me in the middle of it. Okay, she said. Very small. I love you, I said. That part is true, but I cannot be the solution to this, and I am done being the solution to things that aren't my problem. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The dinner I'd made was getting cold. The book was still open to the same page, and I felt underneath everything, underneath the gravity of what was happening to my parents and the knowledge of what lay ahead for all of us, something so quiet, I almost missed it. Relief. The specific, unfamiliar relief of a person who has finally said the full truth out loud and has nothing left to manage. I want to walk you through what happened in the months after that phone call, because I think it's important to be honest about the fact that there was nothing clean or simple about it. Federal investigations move slowly. Consequences unfold over time, not in a single dramatic moment. And living through that time as a daughter, as a victim, as a witness, required a kind of sustained steadiness that I won't pretend was easy. My parents retained an attorney, a criminal defense attorney, which is the appropriate kind for the situation they were in. I will not name him or identify him in any way because his work was between his clients and the law, and that is where it belongs. My father, based on what Patricia was able to advise me generally, faced more significant exposure than my mother. The application had been filed under his primary borrower status, and the signature forgery appeared to have been technically executed under his direction. My mother's degree of involvement and knowledge was apparently a more complicated question
information that the investigation worked to untangle. I did not receive regular updates on the investigation's progress. That is not how these things work. What I received was an occasional contact from Agent Holt when additional documentation from me was needed, and an occasional update from Patricia on the general procedural timeline. What I did receive, regularly and from multiple directions, was contact from my family. Derek called first, about 5 days after my parents were contacted. Derek's call was the most difficult of all of them, which surprised me because Derek and I have never been particularly close. But Derek's call was difficult because Derek was not performing anything. He was genuinely shocked, genuinely distressed, in a way that I found hard to sit beside without wanting to soften it. "Sloan, I can't understand why they did this," he said. "I knew things were bad. I didn't know they were this bad." "I know. Did you have any idea they were going to—" "No, I found out when the FBI called me." A long pause. "God," he exhaled heavily. "Are you okay?" It was such a simple question, and it was, I want to be precise about this, the first time in the entire 31 years of my relationship with my brother that he called me, unprompted, not needing anything, and asked if I was okay. "I'm getting there," I said honestly. "Is there anything I can do?" I thought about that. "Just tell me the truth. If you knew anything about this that I didn't know. I need to know there isn't more." "I swear to you, I didn't know." A pause. "I should have known things were this bad. I should have been paying more attention. I've been—" He stopped, started again. "I've let you carry everything, for years. And I knew that. I let it happen." I didn't respond immediately. Because Derek had just said something that none of the legal documents, none of the federal calls, none of the cooperation with Agent Holt had quite given me. He had seen it, and he had named it. "Thank you for saying that," I said. My aunts and my parents' close friends were a harder audience. There was a woman named Carol, my mother's best friend of 28 years, who called me about 3 weeks into the public awareness phase of the situation, when enough people in their circle had become aware that something serious was happening. Carol was not cruel, but she was direct in the way of someone who has chosen a side and wants me to understand it. "Sloan, they're your parents. Whatever they did, they love you, and this is going to destroy them." "Carol," I said, "what they did is a federal crime. They used my name, my number, and my signature without my knowledge. I didn't report them. I cooperated with an investigation that was already underway when it contacted me. There's a difference." "To a lawyer, maybe." "To the law," I said, "not maybe." She was quiet. "I'm not trying to destroy my parents," I said. "I'm not trying to punish them. I'm trying to not be destroyed myself, and I think that's reasonable." She said goodbye. She was not warm about it. That was the hardest part of the fallout. Not my parents' legal situation, which was serious and real and painful to be adjacent to, but the social repositioning that came with it. The people who looked at a daughter who had cooperated with an investigation into her parents and saw betrayal rather than survival. I thought about those people often in the months that followed. I still think about them. And what I have landed on, after everything, is this. The version of events where I cover for my parents, where I lie to a federal agent, withhold documentation, absorb the consequences of their choices one more time, this time in the form of an identity theft that could have destroyed my credit and my career, that version doesn't make me a loyal daughter. It makes me complicit in a crime. And I am not willing to be complicit in my own harm because other people find my self-protection uncomfortable. Here is what happened. My parents, through their attorney, entered into negotiations with the federal prosecutor's office. I was not part of those negotiations. I did not attend any proceedings. I was not asked to advocate for leniency or for severity. My role in the legal process was as a cooperating witness and victim. I provided documentation, I answered questions when asked, and I otherwise stayed entirely out of the decision-making that determined what happened to my parents. What I can tell you is what I know to be true about the outcome. My father entered a plea agreement.
The specific terms of that agreement are a matter of public record if you know where to look, and I will not detail them here beyond saying that it involved restitution, significant financial penalties, and a period of supervised probation. He did not go to prison. I do not know if that is a relief or not. It is simply the fact of what happened. My mother's situation was resolved separately and with less severe terms, which reflected her degree of direct involvement and cooperation with the investigation. The loan was voided. The fraudulent application was unwound. The account, with its forged cosigner, was removed from my credit report, a process that took 6 weeks and involved 3 separate formal disputes, but was ultimately successful. My credit returned to its pre-incident state within 4 months. The $32,000 I was never repaid remained unrepaid. I did not add it to the restitution claim. I could have. Patricia told me I had the standing to include it in the documented harm. I chose not to, for reasons that I think will be clear by the end of this story. 3 months after the investigation concluded, my coworker and closest work friend, a woman named Danny, invited me to lunch on a Tuesday afternoon and said over sandwiches, with the directness of a person who has decided to say the thing, "I need you to know I think what you did took an enormous amount of strength. And I also need you to know that I've watched you carry things quietly for the entire 4 years I've known you, and I'm glad you finally put something down." I had told Danny about the investigation about a month in. I hadn't been able to hold it completely alone, and she was someone I trusted fully. She had been steady and practical throughout, which is exactly what I had needed. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what you did." She was the first person who wasn't my lawyer to frame it that way, not as a betrayal of my family, as a thing I finally put down. Has anyone ever been that person for you? The one who saw what you were carrying and named it correctly? Not as abandonment or disloyalty or drama, but as the simple, overdue act of putting something down? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I want to be honest with you about where things stand with my parents, because I think the honest version is more useful than a clean resolution. It is complicated, and it will be complicated for a long time. My father and I have spoken 4 times since the investigation concluded. The calls are short. We discuss practical things: his health, my work, the general shape of life. We do not discuss the loan, the investigation, the plea agreement, or the 8 years that preceded all of it. I don't know if we ever will. There is a grief in that I have not fully finished feeling. The grief of loving a parent and discovering, in a concrete and legally documented way, that they are capable of something that would have genuinely destroyed you if it had gone differently. That grief doesn't resolve cleanly. It lives alongside everything else. My mother and I talk more regularly. She has entered a period of what I can only describe as genuine reckoning. Therapy, which she started 6 months after the investigation concluded, and a quieter, more honest way of communicating with me that feels different from anything in the previous 31 years. She said something to me recently that I have turned over many times. "I told myself for years that you were strong enough to handle anything, and I used that as a reason not to protect you. And I think I need to sit with the fact that she can handle it is not the same as she should have had to." That was perhaps the most honest thing she has ever said to me. I told her so. And I cried a little too. Not because the situation had resolved. It hasn't, not fully, and maybe it never will, but because there was something real in the room between us, finally, that hadn't been there before. Something without the soft language and the managed distance and the careful avoidance of the actual truth. Something honest. It was small, and it was late, and it was the beginning of something I don't yet know the shape of, but it was there. It has been 14 months since Agent Holt's phone call on that Wednesday morning. In 14 months,
Here is what I know. I know that cooperating with that investigation was the right thing to do, not just legally, morally. What my parents did was wrong. It was wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when they cause documented, measurable harm to a real person who did not consent to it. And the fact that that person was their daughter does not change the wrongness. It amplifies it. I know that the pull I felt on that first Wednesday evening to protect them anyway, to call them, to warn them, to find some way to absorb this one too, was real and was a product of 31 years of a very specific kind of conditioning. And I know that resisting it was one of the hardest things I have done, and also one of the things I am most at peace with. I know that the people who called me disloyal were not wrong about what I did. I did prioritize truth over family protection, but I do not accept that those two things should always conflict, or that when they do, family protection should automatically win. Loyalty that requires you to participate in your own harm is not loyalty. It is a trap. I started therapy 8 months ago. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Vasquez, who works in trauma-informed financial psychology, which is a specialty I didn't know existed until I needed it, talks about something she calls the absorption identity, the way some people and families develop a core identity built around being the one who takes the hit, who smooths it over, who figures out how to make the unworkable work, quietly and without complaint, until the cost is so normalized they've stopped noticing it. I had believed for 31 years that I had no choice. I had been wrong about that. I have choices. I am making them now, differently, more deliberately, with a clearer understanding of where my line is and what it costs me when I cross it on other people's behalf. The $32,000 I never claimed as restitution, I want to explain that. I could have included it, Patricia made that clear, the documented transfers, the spreadsheet, the 8 years of records. It was exactly the kind of evidence that restitution claims are built on. I chose not to. Not because I don't believe the money is owed. It is. The math is the math. But because I made those transfers freely, I made each one as a choice, imperfectly informed, operating inside a pattern I didn't fully understand, but still a choice. And there was something important to me about not retroactively converting every imperfect choice I made into a legal claim, about drawing the line at what was done to me without my consent, rather than everything I had done under the influence of a family system I hadn't yet learned to see clearly. That line is mine. I drew it there, and I live with it, peacefully, as one of the clearest decisions I have made in this entire situation. I want to say something to you now. If you have been listening to this story and recognizing something, not the FBI call, maybe, but something, underneath it, the pattern underneath it, the years of it, the way a family can use the most reliable person in it as a structural support, quietly and consistently, until the support is so load-bearing that nobody can imagine the structure without it. If you recognize that, I want to say this clearly. Being reliable is not the same as being available for harm. Being financially stable is not an invitation for your stability to be used without your knowledge. Being the one who can handle things does not mean you should handle things that are not yours to handle. You are a person, not a resource, not a structural element in someone else's financial plan. A person with your own name, your own number, your own credit history, your own life, none of which belong to anyone else, regardless of who they are to you. Maybe you're living a version of this. Maybe nobody has forged your signature. Maybe the version you're living is quieter. Loans that aren't repaid, co-signings that were asked for and shouldn't have been, a pattern of quiet extraction that has been building for years and that you've been calling love because you couldn't think of another word for it. I want you to hear this. What you've been calling love might be love, and it also might be a pattern that is costing you more than love should cost. Both things can be true. And if you've been sitting with that, if you've been doing the math and finding that the numbers don't add up the way you've been telling yourself they do, you are not being disloyal by noticing. You are being clear. Clarity is not betrayal. Seeing what is actually happening is not abandonment. It is the beginning of building something that actually works. Final question. If you had answered that phone call, if it had been you, your name, your number, the FBI on the other end, what would you have done? Would you have told the truth immediately? Would you have tried to protect them first? Would you have been somewhere in the middle, trying to find a version of honesty that didn't land as hard? Drop it in the comments. I want to know, because I think the answer says something true about each of us. Not about our morality, but about how deep the pattern goes, how much we've been absorbing, how long we've been telling ourselves that protection and harm can coexist in a relationship without the harm eventually winning. Thank you for being here for the whole thing. This one cost me something to tell, and I hope it was worth the cost. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. I'll be here next week. There's a story in the description that I think you'll need just as much as this one. I'll see you in the next one.